Hello, future doctors, nurses, cow herders, teachers, and anything else you want to be. Welcome to video 35 on strategies. We're going to learn a group of strategies, and it kind of depends on your philosophy. So we're going to learn about the Optimist strategy, a strategy that usually someone who thinks positively would choose. We're going to talk about the Pessimist strategy, the Regret strategy, and the Bayesian strategy. Let's get started. All right, so let's look at this and actually look at what the question is asking before we jump into how to do this. So use this table. It says you have a Math 130 test tomorrow that covers 3 topics: game theory, which is this unit, probability, our last unit, and our first unit, statistics. You plan on studying all night, but unfortunately that still means just studying one of the 3 topics. And your success depends on which of the 3 topics your professor stresses. That's right, you can call me Professor Sorensen. The following payoff matrix, or payoff chart, shows the percentage you can expect to earn on each section depending on how you allot your study time. So this is what you are choosing. These are your 3 options. So you only have one thing to study, or you only have time to study one. So if you choose to study game theory, that's your the choice. If, as your professor, I choose to stress game theory, you're going to get an 85% on that test because you've studied the thing that I'm stressing. However, if the exam actually stresses probability, then you're only going to get a 70% because you studied game theory. And if my test stresses stats, you're going to get a 70%. Now, what was the longest unit that we had to do? Well, obviously that was probability, right? There was tons on that. And notice that this 0.5 means that there's a 50% chance that I'm going to stress probability. So that's what that probability chart here means. Let's look at one more. Let's look at it if you choose to study probability. Well, if I stress game theory, you're going to get a 40% on that test. But if you study probability, sorry about that. If you study probability and the test is mainly on probability, you're going to get a 90. That's pretty sweet. How about if you choose to study probability and it stresses statistics, you are going to get a 40%. So what should you do? That's the question. Should you choose to study probability because that's the highest probability of what it's going to be on? Or should you choose to study game theory because, look, the lowest you can get is a 70%. There are many different answers to this based off of what you value. And so here's what the questions are going to look like. Yes, this is directly from your final from a different year, and this is what it's going to look like. It says, explain the choice that the optimist would make. Explain the choice that the pessimist would make. Explain the choice that the regret strategist would choose, and explain the choice that the Bayesian strategist would choose. It's totally fine if you get the same answer for all these or if you get a different answer for all of these, because these strategists value different things. So let's go ahead and let's tackle this. I would actually take a second because you're going to be able to use your notes, or not your notes, but have kind of like a cheat sheet. This I absolutely would put on a cheat sheet that you're going to use. So pause the video and get those down. Okay, you're back. So what does the optimist do to find which one we should choose? Well, what they do is they find the max of each and then go with the biggest. So let's first look right here. So here I'm going to find the best case scenario. The best case scenario, if I choose game theory, is that I score a 85%. Okay, now, what's the best case scenario if I chose to study probability? Well, the best case scenario in that one would be what? Yeah, it would be to study, to stress probability, and that would be a 90%. Okay, what about this situation here? If I chose to study stats, what's the best case situation there? Well, the best case situation is that I score an 80%. So we want to find the max of each and then go with the biggest. And that means we're going to go with this one right here. We're going to go with probability. Now, I want to talk to you about what this word means right here, max E max. That means you're going to take the maximum of your maximums. So didn't we find the maximum here? Yeah, we wrote down 85 because that was the maximum of that. Did we write down the maximum here? Yeah, that was 90. And did we write down the maximum here? Yeah, that was 80. And of our maximums, these are maximums of each row, we choose our max. So that's 90%. And where does 90% come from? It came from choosing probability. All right, fantastic. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the pessimist strategy. And we're going to find the minimum of each. So let's start with that. What's the minimum of these three? Well, the worst case scenario is you get a 70%. What's the minimum of these in the middle here? Well, the minimum is getting a 40%. That kind of stinks. And what's the minimum here? Well, that's going to be a 40% as well. So the pessimist really believes that the worst thing is going to happen. So they find all the worst case scenarios and then they go with the biggest value. Well, what's the biggest value? That's going to be 70%, or that's going to be game theory. Okay. So what are we finding here? We're finding the maximum of our minimums. So these are all mins. This is the 70 is the smallest, this 40 is the smallest, and that 40 is the smallest. These are all mins, and you want the best case scenario of your worst. So you're trying to find your maximum of all of your mins. So the pessimist thinks the worst thing is going to happen, so might as well go with the best case scenario of all the worst things. All right, so that's the pessimist. Now, the regret strategist is someone who's like, oh, I just really don't want to regret anything. And so what you have to do is minimize your regret. Now, this is definitely the most complicated one, but it's still not too bad. You need to find the regret for every column using the highest value in the column. So let's do that first. What's the highest value in this column? It's 85. So if they stressed game theory, how much would you regret if you chose to study game theory? Well, you would have regretted 0% because you would have gotten your max of 85. Again, if we stress game theory and you chose to study probability, how much would you have regretted studying probability? Well, 45%, right? Because you wish you had studied game theory, this one right here. So I just did 85 minus 40, and that's what gave me that 45. Now, how much would you have regretted choosing to study stats? Well, you really wish that you had studied game theory, right? So you regret 25. Okay? All right, now, let's say that the tests stress probability. Well, you would have regretted studying probability 0 because you would have gotten your best score. So now we're comparing everything with 90. So here we would have regretted 20%, and here we would have regretted 50%. All right. And if you want, you can put these in parentheses to, signify that this is your regret. You don't have to. All right, next one here is, what if the test actually stressed stats? Well, we would have regretted nothing if we chose to study stats, because that would have been the best option here. If the test stressed stats, that you would have studied stats. So that would be 0 regret. But you would actually regret 40% here if you studied probability over stats, and here you'd regret 10%. Remember, we're comparing these numbers to our 80, our best situation. All right, so we've done that. We've found the regret for every column using the highest value in the column. Now we need to list out the maximum regret for each row. So what's the worst case scenario if we chose to study game theory? Well, we would have regretted the worst case scenario here is we would have regretted 20%. Okay, so we've got 20% regret there. Now, how about for the second row there? What's the biggest regret there? Well, here our biggest regret is 45. And if you're not seeing what I'm saying here, I'm comparing this entire row, 45, 0, and 40. And clearly 45 is that best. Sorry, is the worst case scenario here. So we would have regretted 45%. And now the last one here is we've got 25 regret, a 50 regret, and a 0. So here we regret 50% that we could have done something better. So here we've got a regret of 50. Now remember, the regret strategist wants to avoid regretting things, and so we're going to choose the lowest value. So what's the lowest value here? Well, that's going to be 20. Okay, so if we chose to study game theory, and it doesn't matter, what we chose or what the professor chose, the worst case scenario is we're going to regret 20%, and that's not too bad. So in this case, they would have chosen game theory. Now this is called the mini-max, because what we did here is we found the max regret in each row. Okay, so right, isn't 20 the biggest? Yes, it is, of this entire row. Isn't 45 the biggest of that row? Yes. Isn't 50 the biggest of that row? Yes, it is. So these are maxes, but then we went with the min. So that's called the mini-max. And so we want to regret as little as possible, so we're going to go with game theory. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but we've actually yet to involve probability at all in this. And the Bayesian strategist says, hey, what the heck? Like, it's a 50% probability of stressing probability. Shouldn't we take that into account? And so what the Bayesian strategist does is it basically goes to its row. So let's talk about game theory. I'm going to do game theory. And you're going to take 85%, and you've got a 25% chance of getting an 85%. But you've got a 50% chance, okay, a 50% chance of getting a 70%. So I go 70 times 0.5. And then I've got a 0.25% chance of getting a 70 right here. So I'm going to go 70 times 0.25. And that gives me a 73.75. So you should expect, given the probabilities with the Bayesian strategist theory, that you'll get a 73.75%. Okay, let's check out probability. And you might want to pause this and try this on your own, but this is going to be 40% times 0.25 plus 90% times 0.5 plus 40% times 0.25. And I get a 65%. So you should expect to get a 65% if you go with that theory. Well, you're not going to get a 65, but that's kind of averaging out every single situation with these probabilities. Okay, so that's probability. What if we choose to study stats? Okay, so that's going to be 60 times 0.25 plus 40 times 0.5 plus 80 times 0.25. So again, that's 60 times 0.25 plus 40 times 0.5 plus 80 times 0.25. And that gives me 55%. And if you're wondering what is this, this is actually finding the expected value. This is what the value is that you expect to get. And that's V times P. And that's going to be our value, which is our V times our P. So that's what we're doing, kind of a throwback to our probability unit. So which one do we want to choose, the 73.75%, 65, or 55%? Well, obviously, this is the best case scenario, so we're going to choose game theory. I find these really fun. I mean, I think they make sense. All right, here's example 2. Let's find the optimist, the pessimist, the regret strategist, and Bayesian. We're going to go a little bit faster. So remember, the optimist is the maxi-max. So let's go ahead and find the max of this is a 10. The max of this is an 18. And the max of this is a 20. So given this situation, we want to go with the maximum of the maximum situation, and that's going to be 20. So for the optimist, we would build a large plant. Okay, now the pessimist does the same thing, but instead of choosing the maximum values across those rows, we choose the smallest values. And we're going to look for the maxi-min. All right, so what's the lowest situation here? That's going to be a 6. Lowest here is a 7. Lowest here is a -4. Remember, we want to go with the biggest of our bad situation. So our biggest would be this 7 right here, and that's going to be our medium plant for the pessimist. All right, regression strategists, we now need to look at columns here and say, okay, what would we regret if we chose to build a small plant and it ended up being low? Well, since 10 is the highest, we would regret 0 here. What would we regret for 7? Well, we're comparing that to 10. We would regret 3. And how much would we regret if we got -4 instead of 10? Well, that's a value of 14. We're $14 away from that 10 if you want to think of it with dollars. I guess they are in millions of dollars. Okay, how about here? Well, 14 is our biggest. So remember, we're looking straight down this column. So our regret would be 0 on that. We would regret 4 on that, or $4 million. And how do you get from 8 to 14? Well, that would be 6. Okay. All right, last one here is 20 is our best case situation if it ends up being high. So we're going to have 0 here, 2 here, and 14 here. We're comparing all these lower numbers with the biggest one in the column. So now remember, the regret strategist is trying to have the mini max. So we are trying to minimize our regret. So let's go ahead and let's find the biggest regret going across. So what's the biggest regret here? Well, that's 14. What's the biggest regret here? That's 3, isn't it? And what's the biggest regret here? That's 14. So these are the maximums, right? We're finding the max regret, and now I want to minimize it. So which one is the minimum of that? Well, that's going to be 3, because we want to minimize the regret that we have. So we get the max going across the row, right? 14 is the max, 3 is the max, and 14 is the max of each of their rows. But then we want to minimize our regret, so we find that 3 to be the one. So this is going to be a medium plant as well. All right, next one is the one that involves probability. So I'm just going to do this pretty quickly because I think it's got a very clear formula to it. But we're basically going to do, for the first one, 10 times 0.3 plus 10 times 0.2 plus 6 times 0.5, and that gives me 8. Then I'm going to do 7 times 0.3 plus 14 times 0.2 plus 18 times 0.5, and for the medium, that's going to give me 13.9. And the last one, I do -4 times this plus 8 times that plus 20 times that. So that's -4 times 0.3 plus 8 times 0.2 plus 20 times 0.5. And that gives me 10.4. And of course, that's our expected value, right, in millions of dollars. So we would expect 8 million, 13.9 million, and 10.4. So we want to go with the biggest one, which is our medium plant. There we are. Sweet. All right, we got one more. All right, what's the optimist choice here? We'll go across. What's the max of that? That's 45. What's the max of that? That's 70. What is the max of that? That's 53. We want to choose the biggest one. That would be 70. So we would be choosing stocks here. Okay, same thing for the pessimist, but we're going to choose that smallest number. So here we've got 5, -13, and -5. And we want to get the biggest possible value. We think the worst thing is going to happen. Let's pick the best case scenario. In that case, it's going to be bonds, right? 5 is better than all those negatives. Okay, regret strategists, we have to compare our biggest number. Okay, so here's our biggest number in this column. So here we regret 30, here we regret 0, here we regret 17. What's our biggest number in this column? Well, that's the 45 right here. So we regret 0, 15, and 0. Okay, what's our biggest number in our last column? Well, that would be 5. So here we regret 0, regret 18, regret 10. All right, now we go across and we list in the rows the biggest regret. In this case, we've got a huge regret of 30. Here we've got a regret of 18. And here we've got a regret of 17. And we want to minimize our regret, and so we're going to go with our smallest possible regret of 17. So that will be mutual funds. Okay, last one is the Bayesian strategist. I'm just going to get this done fairly quickly for you, but we're basically going to take 40 times 0.6 plus 45 times 0.1 plus 5 times 0.3. We're going to do that for each one. So let's get those 3 done. So that's 40 times 0.6 plus 45 times 0.1 plus 5 times 0.3 gives me 30. Next one is 70 times 0.6 plus 30 times 0.1 plus negative 13 times 0.3, and that's going to give me 41.1. And the next one here is 53 times 0.6 plus 45 times 0.1 minus 5 times 0.3, and that gives me 34.8. Okay, we want the biggest one here, so that's going to be this one. That's our middle one. Our middle one is stocks for that. All right, folks, that's it for this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Spelled stocks wrong. Go me. Have a great day, everyone.